This is all the episodes. I have no idea. I'm not sure actually. Yep, if I can assume. Yeah. Of course. Knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. Should know this. Of course. I know. Definitely. If I can assume. Yep. Before I know this. Of course. Squeak. I know. Definitely. Okay. Anyways, before I talk about them. Yep, that's okay. Yep. Alright then. Whew. Well, that's gonna time me out for that one. Yep. If I can see him visually. Of course. I knew this was to happen. So, if you don't remember, this is not gonna be okay, so, yep. Alright then, if I figured this out, by the way. I know, it's a good point they have to. Definitely. So, you got some bad news? Well, not yet. If I can see him visually. Of course. Yeah? I know. Definitely. Do you get some better issues? Well, not yet. Of course. You assume you better. I didn't know about the issues, Mario. I know, definitely. You have no idea. I know. If I can see it visually. Of course. Okay. So, well, do we have to figure this out from earlier? Well, it's kinda obvious. I guess. Yep. Before I know this, of course. Definitely. Alright then. Whew. Meow, 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 meow. Okay, I was getting spoons about that. Alright then. Meow? Well, it might be, but I can assume we'll get some bad ideas. Meow. I know that, by the way, if I can assume. And how do you know this for the others? Well, not yet, definitely. I still got it around here. It's a good point they have to. I guess that's still true, so they let me know. It's kinda obvious. Okay, I was getting spoons about that. I agree, Meow. So we can't figure this out, so this gives me a good point, so who's gonna find that? Well, not yet, definitely. I still got to find the others. It's still got code for Mario. Right. So we don't have it yet, so what's gonna be? Well, we don't know yet. Okay. Meow. Of course. Knew this was to happen. Okay. Before I know this, of course. Knew this was to happen. It was trying to, by the way. Of course. If I could assume, by the way. It was gonna get to that. Of course. Knew this was to happen. Yep. Okay, so, did we get some ideas? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. Of course. If we had to get some bad ideas, what's gonna be? I don't know yet. Of course, I knew this was to happen. Okay, I was getting some bad ideas. If I can assume, definitely. Of course. Yeah? I agree about this one, by the way. I know, right? It's gonna get to it. Of course. Definitely. If I can assume, by the way. Okay. Well, I was getting some bad ideas. It's supposed not to happen, if I can assume. Of course. It's kinda know this. It's a little bit familiar. And how do I know this? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. If I can assume visually. Right, before I know this, of course. Well, do you, figure this out? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. I knew this was to happen. Yep. Okay. Well, do you have to figure this out? Not yet, definitely. Of course. If I could assume, so what's gonna be? Well, not yet. Okay. You have no idea. I know, definitely. Okay. Still kinda cool from earlier. Do we know that? Okay. It's still kinda cool. I guess that's still true. Okay. How am I gonna figure some of them? I don't know yet, but I need some bad ideas. Of course. I know, right? Definitely. If I could assume to get some bad ideas. I have no idea. You could assume, Vigily. Of course. See, I knew this was supposed to happen. It's a little bit familiar. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. I guess that's still true. Yep. Okay. I still got the fun others. Definitely, but if I could assume, Vigily. Of course. I know. This is not supposed to happen. I guess that's still true. I should know this. Of course. Okay. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Okay, I was good to about that. Squeak. Okay. Alright then, we need some bad ideas. Well, not yet, definitely. We still got the fun others. You're right, definitely. They're still around here for Murray. It's kinda obvious. If I can assume. It's still kinda obvious. If I can assume, Vigily. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Okay, it's kinda obvious. Yep. It's still true. Vigily? Of course. Okay, we need to get some ideas. Meow? Meow, meow, meow. Oh, okay. Meow, meow, meow. Meow, meow, meow. Meow, meow, meow. Right, of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. Before I know this, of course. Okay. Whew. So we're gonna get some bad ideas? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. If I could assume. No, not yet. I still got a familiar. It's getting obvious. Meow? I know, definitely. How are we gonna figure this out? Well, it's kinda obvious, but it might be. Well, you're right. Definitely. So, how are we gonna figure this out? We don't have it yet. Oh, you're right. Definitely. I can assume it might be, but how do you know this? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. I figured this out, so that's gonna be okay, I guess. I guess that's still true. Yep. Before I know this, of course. Knew this was supposed to happen. Before I know this. Of course. I know, right? Before I know this. Definitely. If it was getting some bad ideas. If I could assume. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep, before I know this. Right. Meow. Meow meow. Of course. Knew this was supposed to happen. Okay. So, am I getting some bad ideas? Well, not yet, definitely. If I could assume. Well, not yet. If we had to get some bad ideas, it's still kind of cool. Familiar, definitely. If I could assume to find some bad ideas, I guess that's still true. Yep. Okay. Squeak to sweet. Squeak. Okay. I was concerned about that. Alright then. So, how do we know this about them? Well, not yet, definitely. If I could see him. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen, by the way. I know, if I was getting some bad ideas, of course. Definitely, if I could see him. Yeah, I know, right? If I was getting some bad ideas, of course. If you was gonna notice, it's a little bit familiar. Okay, before I know this. Yeah, of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. It's a little bit familiar. I guess that's still true. Yep. And how do we know this? Well, not yet, definitely. If I could simply. Of course. Knew this was supposed to happen. I literally don't get it. It's a good point they have to. I know, It's still kinda cool familiar. Okay. How do we know? It's kinda obvious. Well, not yet, definitely. If I can assume. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. It's kinda obvious. I know. Definitely, if I can assume, by the way. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. We can't figure it out, so... You got some ideas? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. And that's the reason why we have to. Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. Before I know this. Of course. I did not spoon about that. Yeah, I can see immediately. Of course. If there was getting some ideas. Yep. If I could assume. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. If there was getting some ideas. Of course. Yeah, I know, eh? Yep. If there was getting some ideas. Of course. Before I know this. Squeak? I know, definitely. I can see him. I can see him, Julie. I do. Definitely. If I was getting some ideas. Of course. Well, it's kinda obvious. Okay. Before I know this. Of course. Right. And how do you do this? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. Okay. So you can't figure this out. It's a good point they have to. Right. If I can assume, we don't want to answer these questions yet. Okay. Definitely. If I can assume, it might be. By the way. I know. Definitely. If I was getting some bad news, it's a little bit familiar. If I can assume, it's still kind of cool. I guess that is true. Yep. And how are we gonna figure it out? I know it's just supposed to be. Of course. Definitely. So you had some ideas? Well, not yet, definitely. We still got. Of course. Definitely. If I was getting some ideas. Yep. I still got it, by the way. It's still kind of cool. I guess it's a little bit familiar. Yep. It's kind of obvious if they have to. I guess they're right, by the way. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Before I know this. So, they had to get some ideas? Well, not yet, fully. If I could assume, they might be. Oh, you're right. Definitely. There was getting some ideas. Of course. Knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. Before I know this. Squeak. Of course. Knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. Before I know this. I was getting some ideas. Yeah. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. Before I know this. Of course. There was getting some ideas. Okay. I was getting spoons about that. Did we get some ideas? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. Before I know this. Okay. Well, I was getting some ideas, by the way. Of course. Knew this was supposed to happen. Okay, how do you know this? Well, not yet, definitely. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. And okay, how do we find ours? Well, if I can see him. You still cool for here, by the way. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. This gives me a good point, so what's gonna be? Yeah. Of course. I knew this was supposed to happen. Yep. It's kinda obvious, by the way. I know, eh? If I could simple, by the way. Of course. It's kinda obvious. I know, eh? Definitely. If I could assume. Eventually. You have no idea. I know, why? Yep. I can see him. Definitely. You have no idea. I know, why? Yep. If I can see him visually. Of course. I have no idea. Right. Yeah?